welcome. You've settled into a quiet space, and now it's time to let the present moment drift gently into the distance. Tonight, we'll wander slowly, calmly, and thoughtfully into the world of the Viking Age. But not the stories you may already know. Not the soaring sails of longships or the fury of raids. No, our journey is not one of battle or conquest, but of the quiet, endless days in between. It's the ones filled with cold mornings, weary hands, and a constant battle with the land itself. Imagine yourself not as a warrior, but as a settler. A farmer, a fisherman, a mother waking to tend the hearth, a child clutching fur-lined cloaks against the chill. This is not the Viking Age of legends, but of everyday life. And it was, in many ways, a hard life. One that asked much, gave little, and left its traces only in stone foundations, scraps of cloth, and the bones of sheep long turned to dust. Let us begin, then, in the north. The sun low on the horizon, the sky pale, the air sharp and still. Take a breath. Let your mind soften. Picture the world as it was for a Viking settler, somewhere around the year 950. Segment 1, the cold hearth. A day in the life of a Viking settler. The morning comes, not with fanfare, but with a faint pale glow behind the slats of a sod-roofed house. The room is dark. The fire, once warm and lively in the heart of the dwelling, is now little more than ash and the ghost of yesterday's smoke. You can almost smell the lingering wood smoke, a mix of pine and peat clinging to every surface like a second skin. Inside this single-room home, the walls are made of wattle and daub or stacked turf, and the air is close and damp. Straw-stuffed bedding lines the floor. You might be lying on one now beneath a coarse wool blanket, tucked between siblings or cousins or elders, because warmth is shared. There are no windows, only smoke holes. The air is thick, not unpleasant, but heavy with the scent of damp fur, stale bread, and sweat that never quite washes away. This is your world. The first to rise is often the mother, or the oldest woman in the household. She moves quietly, placing a few kindling twigs in the hearth, coaxing yesterday's embers back to life with a hollowed reed. If she's lucky, the fire catches. If not, someone must run to a neighbor's house with a covered ember pata, small, humble emergency. Breakfast is not a feast. Perhaps it is sour milk, thick, sharp, and nourishing. Maybe a slab of barley bread, chewy and dark. If the family is fortunate, there might be a spoon of butter or fish left from the previous night. A communal bowl, passed from hand to hand. Outside, the cold is relentless. Your home is little defense against the Icelandic wind or the deep frost of a Scandinavian winter. The longhouse creaks and shifts. Snow piles against the door. But the day has begun. There is no rush. The rhythm is slow, but constant. Someone fetches water from a stream or a hole broken in the ice. Someone else begins to grind barley, stone on stone, hour after hour. Children are expected to help. Even the youngest know the feel of wool beneath their fingers, the rhythm of combing flax, the repetition of usefulness. And then there are the animals thin, shaggy sheep, tethered goats, the occasional sturdy horse or scruffy cattle. They are the heartbeat of the farm, and their needs come before your own. If you are old enough to walk, you are old enough to help tend them. Tools are precious. A single axe is shared between neighbors. Iron is rare. When something breaks, it is repaired with care, or replaced with wood, sinew, or clever improvisation. A spoon carved from bone, a needle made from antler. Life here is a kind of slow alchemy, transforming what is found into what is needed. By mid-morning, the household is in motion. Not quickly, but with a certain resigned efficiency. There are no idle hands. Men prepare fishing lines or check the traps in the woods. Women may brew ale, a weak, cloudy drink that keeps better than water. Children gather firewood, stripped from the thinning forest or collected in bundles of driftwood along the shore. The sun, when it appears, casts long, silvery shadows. You can almost feel its light but welcome on your face. There are no clocks. Only the movement of the sun and the rhythm of hunger and fatigue. Dinner, what we would call lunch, is hot if possible. A stew perhaps, made of turnips, onions, dried fish, or smoked lamb. Now flavorful, but warm. Warmth matters more than taste. Everything is served in wooden bowls, shared on a common bench, eaten in silence or quiet conversation. In the afternoon, mending, repairs, digging out snow. In the summer, this is planting time, or haying time, or hunting season. In winter, it is survival. Everything slows. Everything turns inward. As night begins its early descent, the fire becomes central again. People gather close. Stories are told, not wild tales of Odin or Thor, but small ones. Who saw the strange bird near the fjord? Who remembers the man who built this house? Stories are tools, too. They pass down knowledge, caution, and a sense of place. You sit quietly, perhaps spinning thread, perhaps sharpening a knife, perhaps doing nothing at all. The fire dims. The cold returns. The household sleeps together again. Dogs curled at the feet, blankets pulled tight. The day ends much as it began, without fanfare, but full. The Viking settler sleeps, not dreaming of conquest, but of surviving one more day. And you, gently wandering through this far-off world, may find your own eyes growing heavy. When you're ready, we'll continue our journey into the lives behind the legends and the quiet struggles that made up the Viking world. Segment 2. A life in layers. Clothing, comfort, and the cold. Let us move now from the rhythms of a Viking settler's daily life to something more intimate. What they wore, how they stayed warm, how they faced the elements that never quite relented. In a land where even summer could bring a chill, the clothing of a Viking settler was not fashion, it was armor against the cold. A constant effort to keep warmth close and the wind at bay. Imagine yourself standing in the dim light of a longhouse, your breath visible, your fingers stiff. To dress is not a simple act. It is a layered one, done slowly, deliberately. The innermost garment is usually linen tunic for men, a chemise for women. Linen was valued for its softness against the skin, though making it was no small task. The flax had to be grown, harvested, soaked, beaten, combed, spun, and finally woven each step, requiring time, patience, and skilled hands. Many garments were passed down through generations, patched again and again, becoming family heirlooms in cloth. Over the linen came wool, the true shield against the cold. Woolen tunics, cloaks, and trousers were the foundation of warmth. Women wore long overdresses, often suspended by brooches at the shoulders, practical, sturdy, and dyed with whatever nature allowed. Onion skins for golden tones, woad for blue, iron-rich earth for red. The colors were muted, earthy, and often faded with time. Patterns were simple. Stripes and checks were more common than the intricate embroidery we might imagine from museum displays. Those flourishes existed, but mostly among the wealthier or more ceremonial garb. Woolen cloaks were fastened with pins or brooches, sometimes simple, sometimes engraved. These cloaks were crucially used as blankets, padding, and in some cases for carrying items. A well-made cloak could mean the difference between surviving a storm or succumbing to it. For the feet, leather shoes, soft and thin by today's standards, but shaped for walking across uneven ground. These were often made from a single piece of hide, stitched together and tied with strips of leather. They wore out quickly and were constantly patched. In colder months, they might be stuffed with straw or wool for insulation. Socks, when used, were likely made from woven fabric or now binding, a looping technique, older than knitting, that allowed for sturdy fitted garments. Gloves and mittens were rare, but deeply prized. Hands needed freedom to work, but they also needed protection. Scarves or woolen bands were sometimes wrapped around wrists, necks, or heads for extra warmth. Who'd separate garments not part of cloaks were practical and common, shielding the face from wind and snow. Children were dressed like small adults, scaled-down versions of the same layered garments. There was little time or material for novelty. Clothing was a tool. It had to work. A mother might pass a woolen tunic to a daughter, who would wear it until it could no longer be mended, and then use it to line shoes or make patches. We imagine the Vikings as fearsome. Armored figures, and sometimes they were, but the majority of their lives were spent not in metal, but in wool. Armor was for the wealthy, for war, and for show. A settler might never wear armor in their life. Instead, they wore what could be woven, stitched, or salvaged from nature. The scents of clothing were rich and layered, to not perfumed, but real. Smoke from the hearth, the oil of lanolin from unwashed wool, the Thames of salted fish, lingering in sleeves, earthy notes from straw-stuffed shoes. These scents formed a tapestry of daily life, noticed by those living it, but deeply evocative when recalled from afar. Washing clothes was a seasonal task. In summer, garments might be taken to rivers and scrubbed with soap made from animal fat and ash. In winter, garments were often just aired out, hung on branches in the cold sunlight, shaken, and returned to service. The concept of clean was different, measured not by scent, but by function. Adornment was sparse, but meaningful. A single brooch might carry sentimental value. A leather belt, carefully tooled, might have taken weeks to make. Jewelry was not common among settlers, but a simple bead necklace strung with amber or colored glass could be a treasured gift, handed down or traded for something dearly needed. Clothing was survival. Each layer a decision, each patch a memory, each garment a record of time, labor, and care. And as you picture yourself swaddled in these layers, feel the heaviness, the warmth, the gentle scratch of wool on skin. This is not the costume of history, it is a second skin, worn by people who knew the cold not as a passing discomfort, but as a constant presence. Their lives were defined by their ability to adapt, to endure, and to wrap themselves against a world that seldom showed mercy. When you're ready, we'll continue into the realm of belief, superstition, and the quiet mysteries that whispered through every long winter night. Segment 3. Spirits in the Smoke. Belief, superstition. In the unseen, as the light faded early and the cold pressed in tight, Viking settlers turned inward, not only physically, into their hearthlit homes, but also inward into thought, into belief, into the stories they carried, not in books, but in memory, voice, and ritual. In the deep winters, when the land fell silent beneath snow and night stretched on for most of the day, the settlers' minds turned to what lay beyond what could be touched and seen. Imagine yourself sitting by the hearth, the flames low, casting long shadows across the walls of packed earth. Outside, the wind hums through the gaps in the timbers. The animals stir in the byre next to the longhouse, restless. You're not alone, but you feel something await in the air, a sense of presence. For Viking settlers, this was not imagination. It was the world as it truly was. A world filled with spirits, signs, and unseen forces. The Norse cosmos was vast and layered, and for the ordinary settler, it was deeply real. There were gods. Yes, Odin, the one-eyed wanderer, seeking knowledge. Thor, thunderous protector. Freya, generous and feared, but these high deities, while honored, were distant. Daily belief rested closer to the ground, closer to the home, closer to the bones of ancestors buried just beyond the door. There were land spirits who dwelled in hills, stones, groves, and waters. One did not build without first making peace with them. A pile of stones might be left untouched out of respect. A stream might never be dammed. The land had its moods, and settlers did not take without asking. Fences against the landvader were feared to bring misfortune. Poor harvests, sick animals, stillborn children. So people gave offerings. A few drops of ale, a piece of bread, a whispered word. There were house spirits, two called Tyr, often thought to live in the hearth or behind the roof beams. They were protectors, but fickle. They disliked disorder. A dirty hearth or a broken promise could drive them away. Small tokens were left in quiet corners of the home, a bit of food on a shelf, a carved charm near the doorframe. When things went well, the house spirits were thanked. When things went wrong, they were appeased. Even the dead did not fully leave. Ancestors lingered, watching, listening. Burial mounds were not places of final rest, but of presence. Families might visit them, speak to the stones, pour out offerings. At times, the dead were feared, especially those who had died in anger or whose burial had not been properly done. These restless ones were called Draugr, not in the modern sense of horror, but as a natural extension of life gone awry. A sheep behaving oddly, a door creaking open at night, a feeling of being watched. These were signs, not dramatic, not loud, just quiet disturbances in the rhythm of things. To protect themselves, Viking settlers turned to ritual. Women in particular were keepers of such knowledge. Some held the role of Volvava, kind of seeress or wise woman. She might be summoned for special ceremonies, to speak to the spirits, to interpret dreams, to guide decisions. Her tools were simple: a carved staff, a cloak of feathers or fur, perhaps bones or charms or herbs. She did not heal wounds, but she helped maintain balance between the seen and unseen. Dreams were important too. A dream of wolves might mean an oncoming storm. A dream of the sea might signal a death in the family. Children were taught to listen to dreams, to speak of them carefully, and to remember them upon waking. Nighttime was not a time of pure rest. It was a time of signs. Some houses had carved protections above their doors, small symbols scratched into the wood, warding off spirits or calling favor from helpful ones. These symbols weren't standardized, but passed down. Each family might have their own, kind of private language between the living and the unseen. Even everyday actions held meaning. Spilling salt might be bad luck. Cutting bread unevenly could be a sign of disorder in the home. Dropping a knife blade down was ominous. These were not fears as we understand them now, but reminders, ways of noticing the world, of staying in harmony with its patterns. Religion, as we would define it today, was not separate from life. It was its texture, its logic, its undercurrent. The gods did not require constant worship, but they required acknowledgement. Ritual sacrifices were held at key times: harvest, solstice, the start of spring. These were community events filled with food, drink, and solemnity. An animal, often a pig, goat, or horse, might be sacrificed, its blood carefully caught and used to bless tools, homes, or people. Among the poorest settlers, such rituals were symbolic, not grand. A bundle of herbs, a cup of milk. The gesture mattered more than the grandeur. The Christian faith had begun to spread, especially by the later centuries of the Viking Age. Some settlers converted whether from genuine belief, political alliance, or trade advantage. But even among Christians, the old beliefs often lingered. A cross might hang beside a hammer. Prayer to Christ might echo the rhythm of a prayer to Thor. For many, belief was not replaced. It was layered. So imagine yourself again by the hearth. The fire is steady now. The shadows dance slowly. Outside, the snow whispers down. And inside, the world feels thick with memory, with presence, with unseen watchers in the rafters. It is not frightening. It is simply the way things are. A world full of quiet eyes and subtle forces, and you, wrapped in wool and thought, are part of it. When you're ready, we'll move from the mysteries of belief to the challenges of building and surviving in new, harsh lands. Segment 4. Harsh new lands. Building, surviving. The weight of settlement now that we've lingered in the quiet corners of belief and superstition. Let us step outside once more this time, not into the comfort of a long-settled farmstead, but into the raw uncertainty of new land. To be a Viking settler was not to inherit stability. It was to carve it out stone by stone, often from terrain that had never before known the scratch of a plow or the echo of human voices. Imagine yourself on the wind-swept coast of Iceland, sometime in the late 9th century. The sky is a deep, unrelenting gray. Seabirds wheel and cry overhead, their voices lost in the roar of the sea. All around you, the land is wild, jagged lava fields, glacial rivers, hills wrapped in moss. Beautiful, yes, in its way, but not forgiving. And here you have been tasked with beginning again. The voyage that brought you here was long and dangerous. You left behind crowded homesteads in Norway or Denmark, perhaps following a chieftain, perhaps fleeing a feud. You packed your life into a Nair, a wide-bellied ship built for cargo. Not speed and sailed west until the sea gave way to land. And now, before anything else, you must build. But there is no lumberyard, no quarry, no scaffolding. Only what the land allows. In Iceland, trees are sparse. You might find driftwood precious and hoarded or thin birch trees near riverbanks. Turf becomes the settler's material of choice. Thick slabs of grass-covered soil are cut and stacked like bricks, forming walls that insulate against the cold. The roofs are timbered if possible, but often also layered with turf, sprouting grass in summer, freezing solid in winter. The house is long, narrow, and low, easy to heat, easier to build. Windows are nearly non-existent. Light enters only through the door and the smoke hole. The floor is dirt, sometimes lined with planks, sometimes with rushes. There is no chimney. The smoke curls up and out, painting everything with a fine film of soot. Outside the home, more work awaits. The land must be cleared. Stones removed by hand. Brush burned. Soil turned, even if thin and reluctant. The growing season is short. Crops must be hardy barley, perhaps, or root vegetables. The rest of your food must come from the sea, from animals, or from trade. Fishing becomes vital. You learn the tides, the rhythms of the fjord, the seasons of herring and cod. Nets are made from twisted plant fibers, floats from bark or bone. Boats must be built or mended constantly, always at the mercy of weather, always risking too much for too little. And then there's livestock. Sheep, in particular, thrive in these places. They are hardy, adaptable, but they too must be managed. Pens built, fodder stored. Wolves and cold are always threats. A bad winter can wipe out half a herd, and with it, half a year's hope. Every resource has a cost. A single iron nail might come from hundreds of miles away, carried by a trader, bartered for with skins or wool. A piece of fine cloth is not worn, it is banked, saved, perhaps never used at all. Wealth is not measured in coins, but in tools, in stored food, in who has access to a boat or a blacksmith. Water is often drawn from a spring or stream, or in winter, this means breaking ice, hauling buckets, melting snow. There's no well, no pump, no faucet. Everything that is warm must be made so by fire, and the wind never quite stops. It whistles through cracks, rattles doors, tests roofs, shapes the rhythm of your days. A storm might last for days. Snow may fall and fall again, until the landscape becomes a silent, unmarked expanse. But it is not all hardship. There is beauty in the starkness. The northern lights dance in the sky like silent gods. In spring, wildflowers push through black volcanic soil, defiant and sudden. The air is crisp, clean, alive. You begin to know the land not as a stranger, but as something you are slowly learning to understand. Its cycles, its moods, its quiet offers of cooperation. Still, the emotional weight of settlement is not light. Loneliness settles in the same way snow does. Quiet, constant. You may go days without seeing another soul beyond your household. Community is precious, but also fragile. A feud between neighbors can last generations. A bad harvest for one is felt by all, and yet pride makes sharing difficult. News arrives slowly, if at all. Ship from home might bring word of a birth or a death years after the fact. The world shrinks. The memory of where you came from fades, replaced by the immediacy of survival. And yet, settlers endure. They raise children, bury the old, tell stories. They adapt. Homes get stronger. Techniques improve. Crops are rotated. Cattle lines are bred for hardiness. The unfamiliar becomes home, not soft but known. So picture this world, a cluster of turf houses under a slate sky, smoke rising in thin ribbons, a woman bent over a loom, a boy breaking ice with a wooden pole, a man checking the fish drying racks, hoping for sun. There is no glory here, no raids, no kings, only the quiet persistence of people making a life where there was none before. And you, looking out from a turf-framed doorway, watching the low sun hover at the edge of the sea, might feel what they felt. Not triumph, not despair, but something in between. A slow, steady breath in the face of the wind. When you're ready, we'll step inside again into the minds and ambitions of those few who rose above the struggle, and the leaders who shape the fates of others. Segment 5. Chieftains and the ambitions of quiet power. Let us now leave behind the modest homes and cold fields of the ordinary settler and turn our gaze slowly and calmly toward the few who held sway over others. In the Viking Age, power did not sit upon thrones carved in stone or beneath banners of empire. It lived instead in longhouses slightly larger than others, in words spoken over shared mead, and in the quiet leverage of those known as chieftains. A chieftain gogi in Old Norse was not always born to their station, but often enough inherited influence through land, wealth, or lineage. These men, and occasionally women, were not kings in the way we might imagine today. Their power was fluid, personal, and constantly maintained. It rested not on commands but on obligations, webs of favors, loyalties, and the careful balancing of local interests. Imagine now a settlement not unlike those we have already explored, but one with a broader hall at its heart. The longhouse of a chieftain was a place not only of shelter, but of decision. Its walls held more than warmth. They held the rhythm of law, the nuances of diplomacy, and the echoes of ambition. The longhouse might have a raised platform at one end, where the chieftain would sit during gatherings, his cloak heavier, his brooches finer, his words measured. His authority was not absolute, and he knew it. To lead meant to provide through protection, through justice, through feasts when food was scarce. And by offering a strong voice when disputes threatened the fragile peace of a community, he needed allies. Support came from those who respected his judgment, feared his retaliation, or benefited from his success. Loyalty was not given freely. It was earned, nurtured, and sometimes bought. And so the chieftain gave gifts not out of generosity alone, but to secure relationships. A piece of silver, a strong ox, a share of imported goods from the latest ship to arrive from the British Isles. Gifts created bonds, and bonds ensured survival. In return, his followers his thingmanode service. They might offer labor, or follow him in battle, or vote in his favor at the local assembly where laws were made and disputes settled. These things were cornerstones of Viking Age governance, particularly in Iceland, where no central king held sway. The Althing, established around 930, was one of the earliest forms of parliamentary gathering in the world. Chieftains and freemen alike gathered on the plains of Lingvlar each summer. Tents were pitched, goods were traded, alliances formed. But beneath the surface of this camaraderie was a subtle tension politics, played not with speeches, but with quiet negotiations, with alliances sealed by marriage and grievances simmering into blood feuds if left untended. For the chieftain, reputation was everything. Slight could be tolerated only so long. Insult might be answered not with anger, but with a carefully worded challenge. Violence was not the first tool, but it was always within reach. And so the chieftain walked a delicate line between ambition and responsibility, between fear and trust. He could not afford to be cruel, nor could he afford to be weak. His hall was open to petitioners, a farmer whose sheep had been stolen, a widow whose boundary stones had been moved in the night, a craftsman seeking protection for his trade. Each complaint was a chance to earn loyalty or to lose it. The chieftain's household was larger than most. Servants, extended kin, trusted retainers. Meals were more abundant, though never lavish. During feasts, he sat at the center, flanked by his most loyal followers. Mead flowed, but never without purpose. Songs were sung in his honor, but he listened as much as he spoke. The murmurs of discontent were never far. And if he failed, if he misjudged, or hoarded too greedily, or lost to key a lie, his fall could be swift. Another might rise. Power, for all its subtlety, was never safe. It had to be tended like a hearth fire, carefully, constantly, with both patience and readiness. There were those who dreamed of more. Some chieftains looked beyond their valleys and fjords, imagining greater domains, permanent rule, even kingship. But the Viking world was suspicious of such ambition. Independence was prized. The idea of bowing to a single ruler sat uncomfortably with a culture built on negotiation and mutual obligation. Ambitious chieftains had to walk lightly, speaking of unity, of shared prosperity, never domination. In later years, as Christianity spread and royal power grew stronger in Norway and Denmark, the age of the chieftains would wane. But in these earlier days, these long centuries of muddy boots and whispered alliances, the chieftain was the thread that held small societies together. It's not by force alone, but by presence, by negotiation, by standing always at the intersection of community and control. And so, if you stood in the back of that slightly larger longhouse, watching the flicker of firelight on the chieftain's weathered face, you might feel the weight he carried. Not only the expectations of his people, but the fragile web of relationships, grudges, and hope that kept the settlement whole. When you're ready, we'll leave the realm of politics and return once more to the people, this time to the women of the Viking world and the roles they played behind every firelit scene. Segment 5. Chieftains and the Ambitions of Quiet. Power let us now leave behind the modest homes and cold fields of the ordinary settler. and turn our gaze. Slowly and calmly, toward the few who held sway over others. In the Viking Age, power did not sit upon thrones carved in stone or beneath banners of empire. It lived instead in longhouses slightly larger than others, in words spoken over shared mead, and in the quiet leverage of those known as chieftains. A chieftain gogi in Old Norse was not always born to their station, but often enough inherited influence through land, wealth, or lineage. These men, and occasionally women, were not kings in the way we might imagine today. Their power was fluid, personal, and constantly maintained. It rested not on commands but on obligations, webs of favors, loyalties, and the careful balancing of local interests. Imagine now a settlement not unlike those we have already explored, but one with a broader hall at its heart. The longhouse of a chieftain was a place not only of shelter, but of decision. Its walls held more than warmth. They held the rhythm of law, the nuances of diplomacy, and the echoes of ambition. The longhouse might have a raised platform at one end, where the chieftain would sit during gatherings, his cloak heavier, his brooches finer, his words measured. His authority was not absolute, and he knew it. To lead meant to provide through protection, through justice, through feasts when food was scarce. And by offering a strong voice when disputes threatened the fragile peace of a community, he needed allies. Support came from those who respected his judgment, feared his retaliation, or benefited from his success. Loyalty was not given freely. It was earned, nurtured, and sometimes bought. And so the chieftain gave gifts not out of generosity alone, but to secure relationships. A piece of silver, a strong ox, a share of imported goods from the latest ship to arrive from the British Isles. Gifts created bonds, and bonds ensured survival. In return, his followers his thingmanode service. They might offer labor, or follow him in battle, or vote in his favor at the thing the local assembly where laws were made and disputes settled. These things were cornerstones of Viking Age governance, particularly in Iceland, where no central king held sway. The Althing, established around 930, was one of the earliest forms of parliamentary gathering in the world. Chieftains and freemen alike gathered on the plains of Lingvlar each summer. Tents were pitched, goods were traded, alliances formed. But beneath the surface of this camaraderie was a subtle tension politics, played not with speeches, but with quiet negotiations, with alliances sealed by marriage, and grievances simmering into blood feuds, if left untended. For the chieftain, reputation was everything. Slight could be tolerated only so long. Insult might be answered not with anger, but with a carefully worded challenge. Violence was not the first tool, but it was always within reach. And so the chieftain walked a delicate line between ambition and responsibility, between fear and trust. He could not afford to be cruel, nor could he afford to be weak. His hall was open to petitioners, a farmer whose sheep had been stolen, a widow whose boundary stones had been moved in the night, a craftsman seeking protection for his trade. Each complaint was a chance to earn loyalty or to lose it. The chieftain's household was larger than most. Servants, extended kin, trusted retainers. Meals were more abundant, though never lavish. During feasts, he sat at the center, flanked by his most loyal followers. Mead flowed, but never without purpose. Songs were sung in his honor, but he listened as much as he spoke. The murmurs of discontent were never far, and if he failed, if he misjudged, or hoarded too greedily, or lost a key ally, his fall could be swift. Another might rise. Power, for all its subtlety, was never safe. It had to be tended like a hearth fire, carefully, constantly, with both patience and readiness. There were those who dreamed of more. Some chieftains looked beyond their valleys and fjords, imagining greater domains, permanent rule, even kingship. But the Viking world was suspicious of such ambition. Independence was prized. The idea of bowing to a single ruler sat uncomfortably with a culture built on negotiation and mutual obligation. Ambitious chieftains had to walk lightly, speaking of unity, of shared prosperity, never domination. In later years, as Christianity spread and royal power grew stronger in Norway and Denmark, the age of the chieftains would wane. But in these earlier days, these long centuries of muddy boots and whispered alliances, the chieftain was the thread that held small societies together. It's not by force alone, but by presence, by negotiation, by standing always at the intersection of community and control. And so, if you stood in the back of that slightly larger longhouse, watching the flicker of firelight on the chieftain's weathered face, you might feel the weight he carried. Not only the expectations of his people, but the fragile web of relationships, grudges, and hope that kept the settlement whole. When you're ready, we'll leave the realm of politics and return once more to the people, this time to the women of the Viking world, and the roles they played behind every firelit scene. Type continued to proceed to Segment 6. Segment 6. The Hidden Backbone. Women in the Viking world. Let us now return to the heart of the home, not as a retreat from the outer world, but as a place of quiet authority, constant motion, and vital presence. While Viking society often brings to mind images of seafaring men, axes in hand and sails above, the true continuity of life, the rhythm of settlement, survival, and culture was carried in large part by its women. Imagine a longhouse once more. The hearth glows softly, smoke curling toward the beams. Near it, women move through the shadows, not with haste, but with practiced intention. Their hands shape the texture of daily life, grinding grain, spinning wool, stirring stew, tending wounds. But their presence is not limited to domestic labor. It extends outward, into decision-making, property ownership, storytelling, medicine, and belief. Women in Viking societies, especially in settler communities, were more than caretakers. They were keepers of land, weavers of alliances, and the stewards of continuity. When men left to fish, trade, or raid, it was often the women who remained to hold the household together, not as a temporary burden, but as a regular rhythm of life. Legally, Viking women, particularly in Iceland, held more rights than many of their medieval counterparts elsewhere. A woman could inherit property. She could initiate divorce. She could reclaim her dowry if a marriage ended. These were not gestures of generosity from the law, but reflections of a practical reality. Women were integral to the functioning of both family and economy. A typical day for a woman began before the first light, when the air still held the chill of night. She would rise to rekindle the fire, often sleeping nearest it, and begin the day's food. Bread was baked not in ovens, but on flat stones or in iron pans. The grains, usually barley or rye, were ground by hand with heavy stones, often by the same arms that carried children and wove cloth. Spinning and weaving consumed countless hours. Wool was carded, spun into thread, and woven into fabric on upright looms. This fabric clothed families, but it was also currency. Cloth, especially finely woven wool, was a primary trade item. A woman's loom was not just a domestic tool, it was an engine of economic power. Wives of chieftains or wealthy farmers might oversee larger households, including laborers or bondservants. These women became managers of estates, responsible for organizing seasonal work, maintaining stores, and even hosting guests, an essential social responsibility. Hospitality, after all, was a marker of status, and a poorly hosted visitor could carry insult far and wide. Some women held more formal roles of influence. The vulva, as we've touched on earlier, was a figure of spiritual authority. But there were also Licknear healers skilled in herbal remedies, bone setting, and wound care. Knowledge of plants, of poultices, of charms and chants was passed down through generations of women. These remedies were not magic in the fanciful sense. They were the medicine of those without doctors, tested by time, necessity, and careful memory. Women were the ones who sang lullabies and funeral songs, who remembered lineages, and who told the old tales beside the fire. They were memory keepers, preserving the names of ancestors, the terms of land claims, the details of legal disputes. In Iceland's sagas, written down centuries later, women are often the moral compass, the voice of reason, or the catalyst of long-buried vengeance. Their words, measured and sharp, could carry as much weight as any sword. Marriage in the Viking world was often arranged, but not without agency. A woman could refuse a match. Once married, she retained her own property, and her position within the household was protected by both law and custom. Divorce, while not taken lightly, was permitted. Grounds included abuse, neglect, or simply irreconcilable differences. The woman could leave, and she could take what was hers. And yet, like all things, women's lives were not without restriction. Expectations were clear. There were boundaries. A woman who stepped too far from her prescribed role, who wielded too much authority without respect, could be shunned, or worse. Society, though more flexible than we might expect, still carried the weight of tradition. Clothing reflected both modesty and status. Women wore long tunics of wool, layered and belted, with aprons or overdresses suspended by oval brooches. These brooches were not merely decorative, they were personal, symbolic, sometimes passed down like heirlooms. A mother might one day give hers to her daughter, marking the continuity of life, of labor, of lineage. During childbirth, women relied on each other. There were midwives, though they were likely simply elder women with experience. Birth was dangerous, and many did not survive it. Those who did carried both scars and honor. Children were named often on the 9th day, after surviving the initial perilous days. It was then they were truly accepted into the family. In death, women were honored. Their graves often contained tools of their craft, a spindle, a knife, beads, brooches. In some, a staff of power, a cloak, or even a ring of keys symbolizing her authority over the household. These were not buried with her as trophies, but as reflections of who she had been and what she had held together. And so, as you picture her, this woman of quiet strength, you might see her not as a shadow behind her husband, but as the heart around which all things turned. Her days were long, her labor unending, her wisdom inherited, embodied, and passed on. She may not appear in the sagas as often as warriors or kings, but her hand shaped every moment of settlement. Without her, the long house would be cold, the grain unground, the wool unspun, and the children, hearing the stories by the hearth, would have no one to teach them where they came from or who they must become. When you're ready, we'll step outside the household again, this time to follow the footsteps of children and the ways in which they grew, learned, and found their place in this harsh, layered world. Segment 7. Little Footsteps. Childhood and growing. Up in a Viking settlement as we continue this quiet journey through the world of Viking settlers, let us turn our attention to the youngest among them, the children who played between piles of firewood, who whispered stories beside sleeping animals, and who learned not through instruction alone, but by immersion in the rhythm of life around them. Imagine a Viking settlement not in winter's grip, but in late spring. The air is cool, but no longer biting. Small figures run between sod houses, chasing each other with wooden sticks, the thump of bare feet soft against packed earth. These are not children in the way we might think, today set apart. Shielded from responsibility, but smaller members of the household, growing into their duties with each passing day. From the earliest years, a child's life was woven into the pattern of work and survival. Toys existed, yes, a carved wooden horse, a bone doll, a spinning top, but they were not the core of daily life. Play and labor mingled. A young girl learned to card wool while listening to her mother hum beside the loom. A boy watched as his father mended nets or split wood, absorbing the movement, the silence, the patience. Education was experiential. There were no schools, no formal lessons, no parchment scrolls for most. Knowledge was passed in words, in repetition, in imitation. The child learned to identify herbs by scent and shape. Learned to read the sky for weather, to feel the difference between good soil and poor. They learned when to speak and when to wait, how to carry water without spilling, how to dress a wound, how to feed a fire just right. Boys and girls alike were expected to help from a young age. Tasks were divided not rigidly by gender, but by capability and need. A child strong enough to herd sheep might do so, regardless of sex. Another might be tasked with caring for younger siblings, or gathering kindling, or carrying messages between neighbors. The settlement was a machine that required every hand, yet there was gentleness, too. In the quiet moments, songs were sung lullabies with ancient roots, some telling of gods, others of lost places. Mothers might sing while weaving. Fathers might hum as they whittled. These songs were the first stories a child heard, and they stayed in the memory like warmth from a fire long past. The first few years of a child's life were perilous. Illness could strike quickly. Medicine was limited, and many did not survive infancy. For this reason, naming a child often came days after birth. The 9th night, in particular, was significant. a ritual marking of acceptance into the family, a formal welcome to life. Names were carefully chosen. A child might be named after a relative, carrying their memory forward. Or they might be given a name thought to influence their fate-strong names, clever names, names that whispered of resilience or luck. As they grew older, children were increasingly drawn into the adult world. A boy nearing his teens might travel with his father to the thing, listening quietly as disputes were resolved. A girl might be entrusted with preparing food for workers or watching over animals on distant pasture. With each year, the distance between childhood and adulthood narrowed. Games existed, though they often mirrored adult skills. Wrestling, stone throwing, and stick fighting taught coordination and toughness. Board games like Henafadov taught strategy. Riddles sharpened the tongue. Jokes, often earthy and sly, were shared between generations. Humor was valued even in hard places. Clothing for children was practical, often made from the scraps left from adult garments. Tunics, cloaks, simple belts. Shoes if they could be spared, but often bare feet in warmer months. There was little vanity function came first. Discipline varied by household, but it was present. Children were expected to listen, to learn, to contribute. A mistake might be corrected with a quiet word, a sharp look, or in some cases, a harsher reminder. But love was expressed in other ways, in a shared piece of bread. In a hand on the shoulder, in a quiet nod of approval when a task was done well. Stories played a powerful role. The old tales were not just entertainment. They were blueprints, teaching values, warning against folly, passing down cultural memory. A child who listened closely would hear more than just what happened to Thor or Loki. They would hear how to be brave, how to endure, how to be part of something larger. Some children were fostered a common practice that strengthened bonds between families. A boy might live with a relative or ally for a few years, gaining new skills, broadening his world. It was not exile, but enrichment, a way of weaving social ties and spreading knowledge. And as these children grew quietly, steadily, they would one day take on full responsibilities. A girl might become a woman of the household, a spinner, a healer, a trader. A boy might fish, farm, or set off across the sea. But always the lessons of childhood would remain the rhythm of chores, the stories beside the hearth. The smell of wet wool and firewood, the laughter in the middle of long days. Now, close your eyes and picture that small figure again. A child, perhaps no more than 7 or 8, walking across a field with a pail of water, brow furrowed in concentration, careful not to spill. Around them, the world is quiet, a breeze stirs the grass. In the distance, someone calls their name, and you know that this child, like the others before them, will grow into the same steady strength that shaped generations. Quiet, enduring, and deeply rooted. When you're ready, we'll explore the other side of growing older, the lives of the elderly in Viking settlements, and what it meant to age in a world shaped by labor and memory. Segment 8. The weight of time, aging, and the elderly in Viking society. As we continue drifting gently through the quiet details of Viking settlement life, we now arrive at a chapter marked by stillness, by wisdom, and by the slow retreat from toil. In a world shaped by constant work, harsh seasons, and unforgiving terrain, growing old was a rare achievement, and one met with both respect and melancholy. Picture an elder seated near the hearth, wrapped in thick woolen layers, so their hair, if they still had much, would be silvered or white, their face lined by decades of wind and sun. Their hands rest still in their lap, fingers gnarled from labor. They speak little, but when they do, the longhouse listens. Reaching old age in the Viking world was no small feat. Life expectancy was low by modern standards, but that did not mean no one lived long. It meant many didn't reach maturity. If a person lived into their 40s or 50s, especially if they survived the vulnerabilities of youth and the dangers of childbirth, they might well reach 60 or beyond. These elders were treasured not only for their endurance, but for their memory, their knowledge of land boundaries, kinship ties, stories, customs, and the delicate balances that kept communities together. There were no retirement years as we know them. Work didn't cease with age IT, merely changed. An elder who could no longer farm or weave might tend children, mend tools, or prepare herbs. They might sit and talk with neighbors, passing on their insights, watching for patterns others missed. Their labor shifted from physical to social, emotional, and cultural. They became witnesses and repositories of experience. Women, particularly grandmothers, often retained a powerful presence within the household. They might advise on disputes, oversee food stores, or care for newborns. Their authority was quiet but persistent, shaped less by command than by example and memory. Their voices, when raised, carried the gravity of someone who had already seen much and survived. Elder men might no longer hunt or sail, but they carved wood, repaired tools, told stories to the young, and preserved local history in the oral tradition. They remembered past seasons of hunger, past victories in trade or conflict, old feuds, and old resolutions. They were living timelines, consulted like books, respected not only for what they had done, but for what they remembered. But aging also brought vulnerability. Illnesses that today are manageable were often not survivable. Bad fall, failing eyesight, the slow loss of hearing, these things made navigation of the world increasingly difficult. There were no glasses, no canes as we know them. Help came from kin, if available, or from the gentle accommodations of a household that understood the inevitability of decline. Still, there was no formal institution of care, no nursing homes, no doctors in white robes. Care for the elderly was a communal responsibility, carried mostly by family, occasionally by neighbors. And while many were cared for well into their last years, some were not. The poor, the childless, the outcasts, these were more vulnerable. There are stories, preserved in sagas and scattered in archaeological clues, that suggest some may have chosen or been guided toward a quiet end when their burden outweighed their benefit. But such moments were rare, not common practice. More often, the elderly passed gradually, withdrawing into smaller and smaller corners of life, spending more time by the fire, speaking less, watching more. Their funerals reflected their standing. An elder of importance known for wisdom or leadership might be buried with care, laid in a grave with tools, jewelry, tokens from a long life. Others were buried more simply, but always with reverence. The grave was not just a final resting place, it was a continuation. The soul, it was believed, did not vanish, lingered, watched, perhaps helped, if remembered kindly. Graves were visited, stories were told about the dead. Children learned to recognize the names of ancestors, linking themselves to something larger. In this way, the elders who had passed remained part of the living rhythm of the settlement. They were not erased. They were absorbed. And so imagine that same figure by the hearth again, their eyes closed, their breathing slow, their presence a kind of anchor in the room. They may no longer plow fields, chase sheep, or mend sails, but their role has not ended. They hold the memory of what the settlement was and the quiet, steady dignity of having endured. In the Viking world, to age was not only to decline, but to transition from actor to observer, from laborer to storyteller. And in a world so defined by harshness, that transition was a kind of honor. When you're ready, we'll turn our attention outward once again. It's time to the rhythms of trade, travel, and the long distances that Viking settlers bridged not only with ships, but with stories and goods. Segment 9. Across waters and words, trade, travel, and the Viking web. Now let us turn our gaze beyond the fields and longhouses, beyond the slow rhythms of settlement life, toward the open sea, a place both feared and familiar to Viking settlers. Though life was rooted in the soil, it was the water that connected them to the broader world. The settlers were not isolated, not entirely. They were nodes in a sprawling, complex network of exchange of goods, of people, of stories. Picture a narrow fjord in the early morning. A nair, low in the water with a belly full of goods, rests at anchor, sail furled. The crew already on shore, unloading barrels, crates, bales wrapped in woolen cloth, fish dried and salted, soapstone, woolen cloth, iron tools. In return, new goods arrive, glass beads from the east, silk from far warmer lands, spices wrapped in careful bundles, coins with strange inscriptions. Trade was a lifeline. Settlements where the land yielded only so much, and winters were long. The ability to connect with others, to barter, to sell, to receive meant survival. Viking settlers were traders as much as they were farmers. Men sailed along the coasts of the British Isles, to the Franks, to the Baltics, even to the edges of Byzantium. The Nair, a sturdy and capacious ship, was built not for raiding, but for carrying cargo. But travel was not only for men. Some women accompanied their husbands on trading journeys. Others managed to trade at home, particularly in marketplaces. Silver was measured by weight. Arm rings, coins, cut pieces of silver all were part of the hack silver economy. Goods might be traded by value, not by price. A bolt of dyed cloth for a necklace, a fine comb for a sack of flour. Every object had a story. A brooch of Irish design might be worn proudly in a settlement in Greenland. A blade forged in the Carolingian heartland might sit in a chieftain's hall in Iceland. Trade was more than commerce, it was cultural exchange. Ideas traveled in pockets. Religious practices, languages, names. Settlers welcomed traders, not just for what they brought, but for what they represented. News. In an age without paper, without printing, without formal communication, word of mouth was everything. A merchant arriving from Norway might bring tales of a new king, of a harsh winter, of a successful harvest. These tidings shaped decisions whether to leave, to stay, to seek alliances. Travel was dangerous. The sea was never tame. A sudden storm could drown entire crews. Rocks lurked beneath dark waters. Ships could founder. Even on land, travel was uncertain. Paths were narrow. Maps, if they existed, were memory-bound. Hospitality was essential. A traveler depended on the generosity of strangers, on customs of shared food and fire. In settlements, marketplaces formed often informally, along a shoreline or beside a road. A few tents at first, then more. The goods displayed on cloth, on barrels, on carts. Voices low, then rising, haggling laughter, language shifting mid-sentence. These gatherings were also social events. A chance for distant neighbors to see one another, for songs to be sung, for stories to be shared, and marriages to be arranged. And some goods were symbolic. Amber, carried from the Baltic, was believed to hold protective powers. Glass beads, delicate and colored, were worn not only for beauty, but for what they said about a family's wealth and reach. A finely wrought comb might be as treasured as a blade, utility and beauty intertwined. Not all trade was peaceful. Competition existed. Jealousy. Theft. A trader who returned with riches might be followed. A deal gone wrong could lead to a feud. But the Viking settlers, for all their rugged independence, understood deeply the value of connection. And so, through trade and travel, even the most remote farmstead was part of a larger web. Not global in the modern sense, but surprisingly wide. From the Arctic Circle to Constantinople, from the steppes to the Irish coast, goods moved, people moved, ideas moved. At home, a woman might grind barley while wearing beads from a land she had never seen. A child might play with a toy carved in a foreign style. A man might tell tales of far-off cities whose names he could barely pronounce, all of it woven into the rhythm of daily life. In this way, the Viking world, even at its most isolated, was never fully alone. The sea, for all its chill and uncertainty, was a road as much as a barrier. A road lined with memory, movement, and the quiet persistence of exchange. When you're ready, we'll explore the seasonal cycles of labor and celebration, the way settlers marked the turning of the year, and the festivals that gave shape to time. Segment 10. The Wheel of the Year. Seasons, Rituals. In celebration, as we drift further into the quiet fabric of Viking settler life, it becomes clear that their days are so full of labor and adaptation were not merely endured. They were marked, shaped, and softened by the rhythm of the seasons. The passage of time was not measured by clocks or calendars, but by the tilt of the sun, the thaw of the earth, the harvest of fields, and the quiet return of snow. Let us imagine a settlement at dusk in late autumn. Smoke rises in threads from turf-roofed homes. The air is crisp, the smell of burning wood mingled with that of roasting meat. Inside one of the homes, a small gathering forms. There is quiet laughter, the clink of drinking horns, a song beginning softly in one corner. It is winter nights, a traditional festival to mark the end of the harvest and the beginning of the long dark. Seasonal festivals were the punctuation marks of settler life. They were not merely moments of relief, but acts of communal resilience, shared rituals that reminded people They were not alone in the turning of the year. In spring, Disablat was held in honor of the female ancestral spirits. Offerings were made to ensure fertility of the land and protection for the family. Though the specifics varied by region and household, the ritual often involved feasting, storytelling, and quiet prayer. The thawing earth was a signal. Soon it would be time to sow again, to begin another cycle of tending and waiting. Summer brought longer days and greater movement. Animals were taken to high pastures, and travel became more feasible. This was often a time of weddings, of gatherings, of outings, when the community would assemble not only to settle disputes, but to reaffirm its shared customs. The festival of midsummer, held at the solstice, celebrated the light. Fires were lit, symbolizing the sun's height. Songs echoed across hills and fjords, and dances were shared in circles that had held the same steps for generations. It was a brief moment of abundance before the shortening days turned again. Autumn was the season of harvest of calculation. How much hay had been stored? Were the sheep fat enough to last the winter? Is the grain enough to be milled, enough to feed? And it was in this turning that winter nights arrived, usually in late October. It marked the beginning of the Norse year, and it was as much a spiritual observance as it was a practical one. Ancestors were honored. The gods of the hearth and field were thanked. Some families lit candles or torches, small flames against the encroaching dark. Then came winter. Long, difficult, sometimes brutal. But even this season had its moments of joy. Yule, perhaps the most well-known of Norse festivals, was held in midwinter. Lasting for several days, Yule was a time of storytelling, feasting, and fire. Evergreen branches were brought indoors. Candles and oil lamps were kept burning through the darkest nights, a promise of returning light. Small gifts were exchanged, often handmade, a carved bead, a woven charm, a baked treat. These festivals were deeply rooted in both pagan and practical traditions. Even as Christianity slowly spread through Norse territories, many of these customs endured, transformed gently, but retaining their core essence: connection, gratitude, and continuity. The calendar of the Viking world was not a rigid one. Time moved in waves, tied to nature's pulse. The moon was closely watched, as were stars, the behavior of birds, the budding of plants. Each season brought specific labors, and within those labors were smaller rituals: first shearing, first snow, first frost, first birth of lamb. For Viking settlers, celebration was not mere pleasure. It was a necessary recalibration, a brief pause to acknowledge the invisible forces that shaped their days. It was a release of tension, a renewal of shared memory. These were communities where joy was hard won, and therefore deeply felt. A well-pulled harvest could bring laughter as hearty as any gold, and celebration did not always need a festival: child's naming, the return of a traveler, the successful completion of a roof before snowfall. All these could become moments of quiet celebration: a meal shared with an extra slice of cheese, a song sung before sleep. Imagine once more that settlement under the stars. The night is cold, but within the longhouse, warmth flickers across walls. Someone sings an old melody, slow and steady. A few listen, a few hum along. The past is there in the song, and the future waits in the coals. Outside, the snow begins to fall again, soft and silent. When you're ready, we will shift our focus to a subject that lingers beneath even the most ordinary day: the ever-present possibility of conflict, how disputes, feuds, and blood were handled in a culture that prized honor, yet valued survival. Segment 11. Feuds, justice, and the quiet murmur of conflict. As we continue to walk gently through the layers of Viking settler life, we come to a reality that lay just beneath the surface of every field. Every feast, every shared labor, conflict. In a world with no centralized government, no standing police force, and no fortified walls of law, the question of justice, of right and wrong, of injury and reparation was deeply personal and profoundly social. Imagine now, a quiet morning. The fog has not yet lifted. A man walks up the path to the chieftain's hall, his cloak damped from dew, his expression unreadable. Behind him, perhaps a brother, a neighbor, someone to bear witness. He is not here to shout or threaten. He is here because something has gone wrong. Perhaps a boundary has been moved, a sheep taken, an insult made too loudly in the hall. And now, the old mechanisms of justice begin to stir. Disputes were inevitable. Land was precious, livestock valuable, and honor more so. The mechanisms for settling these disputes, though at times volatile, were structured and deeply embedded in tradition. At the center of it all was the thing, the public assembly of free men, where cases could be brought, witnesses heard, and resolutions agreed upon. In Iceland, the legal system was particularly advanced for its time. The Althing, founded around 930, was not merely a gathering of chieftains. It was a legislative and judicial forum, a place where laws were recited aloud since they were not yet written, and judgments passed with care. The law speaker, a position of great esteem, memorized the law in its entirety and proclaimed it bit by bit across the summers. Justice was not about incarceration. There were no prisons. Instead, it was about compensation, restitution, and when necessary, exile or vengeance. If a man was found guilty of theft, he might be fined. If he could not pay, his property could be seized. If he committed a killing, the matter became more delicate. There were procedures, finswurgled, or man-priests could be paid to the victim's family. But sometimes that was not enough. Some families chose instead the path of food along, slow-burning conflict that could stretch across years, even generations. Blood demanded blood. Brother slain might be avenged by a cousin. The cousin's death might summon retaliation in turn. And yet even these feuds were governed by expectations. Killing was not done in secret. It was done with witnesses, formal announcements, with responsibility. It was a heavy thing to carry vengeance. It disrupted trade. It pulled families apart, placed pressure on entire communities. And so often, feuds were eventually resolved not by defeat, but by weariness. A marriage arranged between houses, a gift accepted, a hand finally extended. There were, of course, more informal ways of resolving tension. Mediation by a respected elder, gifts given in apology, a sheep or a sword offered quietly, without ceremony. These quiet exchanges, often undocumented, were the true balm of the Viking world. They allowed for the preservation of peace without the loss of face. Women, too, played roles in this realm. Though they did not speak at the thing, they influenced decisions behind the scenes. A wife might urge her husband to seek peace, to protect their children. Or, if wronged deeply, she might demand justice, pushing events forward with a few quiet words. In the sagas, it is often women who remember the insult, who insist on the oath, who bring forth the memory of the wrong when others might wish to forget. It's important to remember that violence, though present, was not constant. Most settlers lived their lives without ever lifting a weapon in anger. They built fences, not battlefields. They avoided trouble when they could. A man with a strong back and a peaceful reputation was often more respected than one who boasted of his sword. Still, weapons were kept close. Axes, spears, knives, not only for defense, but as tools, as symbols. A man without a weapon was seen as vulnerable, a household without one, exposed. And so, conflict remained a quiet presence, like the distant rumble of thunder beyond the hills. It could come swiftly, but more often it moved slowly, tangled in pride and silence. And when it did erupt, the echoes would ripple through the generations, leaving behind not just graves, but stories. Stories that were told and retold at the hearth, at the thing, in whispers during winter. They became the sagas, those long, winding tales where truth and memory blurred, and where justice was never quite simple. When you're ready, we'll set aside the weight of conflict and turn toward the inner world of belief of gods, spirits, and the unseen threads that bound the Viking settlers to the mysteries of existence. Segment 12. Gods, spirits, and the quiet murmurs of belief. As we step away from the tension of feuds and justice, our path now takes us into the quieter realms, into the minds and hearts of Viking settlers and the beliefs that shaped their days, guided their rituals, and filled their long, dark winters with stories and meaning. For in every creak of timber, every gust of wind, in every strange dream, they found whispers of the divine and the unknown. Belief was not a rigid system imposed from above, but a gentle thread woven into the fabric of everyday life. The Norse gods Odin, Thor, Freya, Frigg, and others were not distant, unapproachable deities. They were known, spoken of, and often felt as close companions in the unpredictability of nature. Odin, the one-eyed seeker of wisdom who wandered the world in disguise. Thor, whose hammer protected against chaos and whose thunder rolled across stormy skies. Freya, who governed love, fertility, and the fates of the dead. In settlements, shrines were not always grand temples. Carved figure tucked into a wall niche. Simple offering left near a tree or a stone. A bowl of milk poured onto the ground. Belief lived in gesture more than structure. It was personal, sometimes secret, and often intertwined with old customs passed down from mothers and grandmothers. Imagine a quiet morning, frost still glistening on the grass. A woman steps out of the longhouse and places a small loaf of bread near a standing stone, whispering thanks for her child's recovery from illness. No grand proclamation, no ritual robes, just a private moment, full of weight. The land itself was alive. Spirits known as Landvitered the hills, the rocks, the forests. These were not gods, but guardians, sensitive to disrespect. A careless act cutting down the wrong tree, failing to greet the wind, might invite misfortune. These beliefs created a quiet sense of reverence for the natural world, encouraging care in how the land was treated. And then there were the Disur and Filebur female spirits associated with fate, family, and personal destiny. They appeared in dreams, often as animals or women cloaked in shadow. Sighting of one's Filgia could be a warning or a blessing. These encounters were not shared lightly. They were remembered, spoken of only to those closest, like a trembling thread pulled briefly into view from the invisible weave of fate. Seers and wise women Vevler held a unique place in this spiritual landscape. They did not perform magic in the theatrical sense. Instead, they channeled knowledge through song, trance, and symbol. A Volva might be consulted before a journey, during illness, or when omens seemed unclear. She would sit, cloaked and staff in hand, and speak of what might come, her voice rising and falling like the wind through the reeds. Death, too, was deeply imbued with belief. The soul's journey did not end at the grave. It continued to hell, or to Valhalla, or to places unnamed. The dead might be buried with their possessions, tools, jewelry, food, and even animals. These were not tokens of wealth alone, but provisions for the next world. A man might be laid with his axe, a woman with her keys. The grave was a portal, not just a resting place. Sometimes, especially for the wealthy or renowned, a ship burial was prepared. The body placed in a boat, surrounded by goods, then covered with earth and stone. It was not only a passage to the afterlife, it was a message to the living, a sign of status, a remembrance of movement and voyage. Christianity, too, began to drift into these lands, at first as rumor, then as presence. Some settlers converted gradually, drawn by new ideas, new allies, or political convenience. Crosses began to appear beside hammers. Psalms were murmured beside ancient charms. For many, the transition was not a break, but a blending. The old ways did not vanish overnight. They lingered, quietly in customs, in language, in the way fires were lit or bread was baked on certain days. Faith was never far from daily life. A sudden illness, poor harvest, a dream of a serpent coiled beneath the floorboards. These things were not dismissed. They were interpreted, respected, integrated. A child might wear a charm around the neck. A doorframe might be carved with protective runes. Yet in all this, belief was rarely loud. It did not demand spectacle. It moved gently, like mist over fields. It was in the songs sung during winter, in the pauses before meals, in the stories passed from elders to children by flickering firelight. So, imagine once more a small gathering. A man tells a tale of Odin's cleverness. A woman adds a detail she remembers from her mother's voice. A child listens, wide-eyed, feeling not fear, but connection both to the gods and to the warm, living world around them. When you are ready, we'll step back into the physical world, into the construction of homes and tools, to explore how settlers shaped their environments, how they built, mended, and left their mark on the land with quiet determination. Segment 13. Building a life. Homes, tools, and the craft of survival as we gently move from the unseen to the tangible, from belief to wood and stone. Let us settle now into the quiet world of craftsmanship, the everyday building and making that defined the Viking settlers' existence. For in a land where nature offered no convenience, survival was not simply a matter of endurance. It was a craft, a continual act of shaping the world just enough to make it livable. Imagine a clearing on a gentle slope, wind curling through grass, still wet with dew. A man stands beside a growing structure. Timber posts lean against one another, partially thatched, the smell of fresh-cut wood sharp in the morning air. Beside him, his son learns not through lecture, but by watching the steady rhythm of the mallet. The precise angle of the blade, the way joints fit without nails, held fast by tension and tradition. Viking homes were practical, functional, and deeply tied to the materials available. A longhouse, often up to 20 meters or more, was the center of life. Its walls were built from timber or turf, its roof pitched steeply to shed snow, its floor sometimes sunk below ground level for insulation. Sod was layered over the roof, held in place by stones or wood, blending the house into the landscape like a low hill sprouting from the earth. The interior was dark and smoky, lit by the central hearth. There were few windows. Smoke escaped slowly through a hole in the roof or between wall beams. The air was thick but warm. Along the walls, raised wooden platforms served as beds, seating, and storage. Every item had its place, because space was precious. Tools were simple but efficient. The axe was both weapon and implement used for felling trees, splitting logs, shaping beams. Knives were constant companions, worn at the belt, used for carving, food preparation, repair. Iron, precious, and often imported, was used carefully. Blacksmiths were respected artisans, turning raw or scrap into nails, horseshoes, rivets, and hinges. To build was to remember how others had built. Knowledge was passed hand to hand. There were no blueprints, but there was memory of which trees made the strongest frames, which grasses made the best thatch, which types of clay held through the winter frost. Children learned by helping, by watching. An older brother might show a younger how to bind a rafter. Mother might teach a daughter how to shape a pot that wouldn't crack in fire. Craft was not limited to construction. Textiles, as we've seen, were woven on upright looms. Leather was tanned using animal brains and bark, then cut and stitched into shoes, belts, pouches. Bone and antler were carved into combs, needle cases, buttons. Even everyday objects were shaped with care, not for ornament alone, but because making something well was an act of quiet pride. Boats were the pinnacle of Viking craftsmanship. While raiding ships get the glory in sagas, it was the broad, sturdy nares, the merchant vessels that truly enabled settlement. These ships were designed to carry cargo across vast distances. They were clinker-built, meaning planks overlapped and were fastened with iron rivets, allowing for both strength and flexibility in rough seas. A ship was not only a means of movement, it was an extension of the home, the farm, the life of the settler. It took a village to build one, literally. Timber had to be chosen with care. Bent ribs steamed into place. Tar applied to seal every seam. It was not work done in haste, and once built, a ship was treated with reverence. Smaller boats were common two-dugouts or plank boats used for fishing, ferrying, crossing rivers. Tools and supplies had to be waterproofed, stowed well, protected from rot. Ropes were made from animal sinew or twisted flax. Sails were heavy wool, painstakingly stitched and reinforced. Yet not all building was grand. A fence to keep sheep in, a cradle carved for a new child, storage chests to hold winter rye. These tasks filled the spaces between seasons, and each was an expression of care for the land, for the family, for the years to come. When something broke, it was mended. Metal was melted and recast. Wood was patched or repurposed. There was no waste, not because of ideology, but because necessity demanded it. Settlers learned to see potential in scraps. A broken bowl became a scoop. A snapped handle became a peg. And through this endless cycle of building and mending, a Viking settler left their imprint on the landscape, not in towering monuments, but in lines of stone marking boundaries, in paths worn down by feet and hooves, in homes that sank slowly into the earth long after they were abandoned. Even today, the remains of these lives speak softly post holes in the soil. Blackened hearths beneath turf, forgotten wells. The craftsmanship has faded, but the logic remains. To shape the world carefully was to survive it. To survive it was to be remembered. So now, as we rest in the quiet hush of a finished longhouse, the fire crackling low and the roof beams creaking softly in the wind, we might reflect on all that hands can build, not only walls and roofs, but continuity and comfort, and the echo of a life made slowly, patiently, with purpose. When you're ready, we'll turn toward the sagas themselves, those long, winding tales preserved in memory and eventually in ink, which carried the spirit of Viking settlers far beyond their lifetimes. Segment 14, Sagas, Memory, and the stories that outlived them all. Let us now turn our attention to the voices that lingered long after the tools were put down, the longhouses crumbled, and the ships vanished into mist. For in the Viking world, while death might come early and winters were long, the human need to remember, to share, to explain, endured. And it is through their stories long and winding, softly spoken and carefully passed, that Viking settlers carved their most enduring legacy. The sagas, those richly detailed narratives of family, feud, travel, and transformation, did not begin as books. They began as breath, as tales murmured over evening meals, as memories retold by elders whose own parents had heard them from others. They were oral history first, preserved not by parchment but by repetition, performance, and the simple reverence for words that meant something. Imagine a quiet night inside a longhouse. The fire has burned down to embers. Outside, the snow presses gently against the walls. Inside, a woman sits with a spindle in hand, or a man with a cup of ale. Someone begins a story. Perhaps it's a tale of a great-grandfather who crossed the sea and settled land where no one dared, or of a woman who held her household together through famine with nothing but cleverness and quiet strength, or of two brothers divided by pride who only found peace at the end of their lives. These are not fantasy. They are rooted in memory, woven with fact, stretched by time, but anchored in place and people. Some of the sagas, like Egil Saga, Laxdæla Saga, or Sagwa, would not be written down until generations later. In Iceland, when parchment and Christian literacy began to spread, but their bones are older, the rhythms, the structures, the themes, they were already ancient by then. The scribes wrote what had been spoken in hundreds of variations around fires, on boats, at gatherings. The sagas served many purposes. They entertained, certainly, but they also instructed. They preserved social norms, how to settle a dispute, how to honor a guest, how to raise children, how to speak in the assembly. They immortalized virtues, strength, wisdom, loyalty, patience, and cautioned against excess, pride, haste, wrath. Some were heroic, detailing travels to distant lands, battles fought and won, treasures claimed and lost. But many were domestic, deeply local, and surprisingly introspective. They spoke of marriages, of inheritance disputes, of weather patterns, of famine. They told of dreams and omens, of strange happenings, a glowing light in the distance, a voice heard in sleep, a raven that visited too often. Through these stories, a settler learned who they weren't just as individuals, but as part of a lineage, a place, a continuum. To forget the sagas was to lose one's bearings. Know them was to carry history inside. And these stories, passed along carefully, became more than memory, they became identity. Even as the Viking Age faded, and new rulers, new religions, and new boundaries took shape, the sagas remained. They were written down, preserved in the cold clarity of ink, and survived long after the settlements themselves disappeared into turf and time. Some Viking settlers themselves were aware of their role in this chain of memory. A stone might be raised with a carved inscription, in memory of so-and-so, who sailed west and never returned. A poem might be composed and taught to children. A name might be given to a newborn that once belonged to a long-lost ancestor, so that no one truly vanished. And not all sagas were grand. Many were personal, a dream recounted, a joke remembered. A phrase that a grandfather always used, carried forward in speech. Even in hardship, the stories endured. In fact, hardship often sharpened memory. The colder the night, the more welcome the tale. In their sagas, the Viking settlers left not only a map of their world, but of their inner lives, their fears, their hopes, their struggles with morality and fate, their reverence for land and kin, their love of cleverness, and their deep understanding that life was fragile and uncertain, and thus worth narrating. And so, In the low warmth of a hearth long extinguished, we can still almost hear them. The cadence of an old voice, the pause for emphasis, the smile before a known line, the long, slow sigh as the tale comes to its end. When you're ready, we'll enter our final chapter, gentle reflection on the fading of this world and the comforts that separate our present from their past. Segment 15, the long fade, decline, memory, and the gentle distance of time. Now, as our journey begins to draw toward its quiet close, we step softly into the twilight of the Viking settler world, not with sudden collapse, not with flame or fury, but with a slow, almost imperceptible fading. Like the last smoke drifting from an evening hearth, the world of these settlers lingered in place even as new patterns, new rulers and new beliefs gently folded over it. Viking settlement did not end all at once. Rather, it unraveled thread by thread, some strands pulled by weather, others by war, and still more by shifting alliances and cultural tides. The land, ever indifferent, continued its rhythms. But the people, in time, began to change. New names appeared. Crosses were raised where once stood carved staves. Languages bent and merged. And the old customs, while not forgotten, became memories rather than practices. Imagine a settlement in its later years. The longhouse is still there, but weathered, softened by moss and time. Children chase each other between fields that were once fiercely defended, now left to grow wild. A man sits by the door, watching the sky, and in his hand he holds a carved object, not a tool, but something older, a keepsake, a symbol. Perhaps it was his grandfather's. Perhaps it came from across the sea. He doesn't know, not entirely, but he keeps it nonetheless. Christianity spread, not through fire, but through families. A chieftain converted for alliance, child baptized quietly, with one name in the church and another at home. A new kind of story entered the world of saints and miracles, of written scripture and stone churches. And for a time, these stories lived beside the old ones, not replacing, but weaving into them. In some places, like Greenland, decline came in waves of frost and silence. The climate cooled, the soil grew thin. Trade routes dried up. A boat that sailed east was never seen again. Church was built of stone, but the fields around it emptied. Archaeologists would later find the bones, quiet, untroubled, buried with care. There was no violence, just quiet departure. Elsewhere, Viking settlers became simply settlers absorbed into larger nations and systems. Their ships still sailed, but they bore flags not of clans but of crowns. Their languages drifted into dialects. Their customs were recorded by others, and eventually by themselves. And all the while, life continued. Harvests, births, winters, laughter, death, as it always had. And yet, something of that early world remained, not in grandeur, but in simplicity, in the way a house was shaped. In the rhythm of a song, the names carved into stones, long worn by wind, but still legible. In the quiet pride of a people who built their lives, not with empires, but with effort. We now see this past only dimly. Through excavated bones, through sagas inked by monastic hands, through fragments of combs and beads, day, a rusted blade, a loom weight, a wooden spoon buried in peat, each piece a whisper, but perhaps that is fitting. The Viking settler life was not one of spectacle. It was a life of continuity, of adaptation, of patience. A life lived close to the elements, where triumph was survival and meaning was found in the texture of everyday things. And so, as we reflect on these lives lived in silence, we might feel not sorrow, but softness. Not loss, but a gentle distance. They were not so unlike us. They sought warmth and food and love. They built, they remembered, they believed. And though their world has faded into the long hush of time, the shape of their hands still lingers in the beams of old farmhouses, in the lines of a story, in the enduring pattern of a woven cloth. When you're ready, I'll guide you into a final, gentle closing, a reflection to settle the mind and ease you into sleep, where perhaps the quiet rhythm of the past can drift with you a little longer. And now, dear listener, the long arc of this journey draws to its close knot with a flourish, but with a hush, as all good stories do when they've said what they came to say. We've wandered through the quiet folds of Viking settler life, not as conquerors or warriors, but as those who endured, those who built, mended, hoped, and remembered. You've walked across frost-bitten fields and along windswept shores, sat beside quiet hearths where stories were passed from voice to voice, watched ships rise against the horizon, and heard the creak of timber beneath careful hands. You've seen hardship, yes, but also patience, faith, resilience. The quiet, steady kind that doesn't shout but simply continues. And in that, perhaps there is comfort. For though their world has faded into peat and dust, the rhythm of their lives is not so far from your own. The settling of a house into the earth, the turning of seasons, the soft repetition of daily things, these are constants. They're unchanging, even across centuries. Tonight, as you lie still, you might imagine one of their homes, a long house, half buried in snow, its roof warm from within, smoke curling lazily into a pale winter sky. Tide, someone stirs a pot over a fire. Someone else hums a song that no longer has words. A child sleeps under a fur blanket. Outside, a distant owl calls. The wind presses gently at the door, but it does not enter. That world is gone. But for a moment, in this quiet space between waking and sleep, it is lived again through your mind, through your breath, through your listening. May your own rest be warm and long and deep. Good night.